Thanks for staying with us. South Africa has declined an appeal from the European Union to use its influence over Russia to persuade it to end its war against Ukraine. It comes after EU Vice President and Foreign Minister Josep Borrell made the public appeal to his counterpart Naledi Pandor at the end of the 15th South Africa European Union ministerial meeting. The EU condemns Russia's aggression, and many of its members are arming Ukraine to repel the Russian invasion. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Isike, the director of the Center for Studies in the United States at the University of Pretoria. Very good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us, Professor Isike. South Africa has maintained a non-aligned stance, declining this appeal from the EU to use its influence over Russia to persuade it to end its war against Ukraine. How should this stance be interpreted?
Well, it is undue pressure that South Africa should not be faced with. South Africa has, agency and a right to take a stand or have a position on any global issue. It has clearly, based on its foreign policy principles and in tandem with the African Union Agenda 2063, taking a position of neutrality, and South Africa should not be pressured, because any position it takes does not always have to be black or white or for or against anyone. The position can be gray in between black and white, and that is indeed a position in itself. But I would understand why they seem to be putting these pressures on South Africa. So, for example, in this instance, South Africa believes in dialogue and non-violent resolution of conflict in line with its humanist Ubuntu worldview. However, it is important for us to take a position and pursue and defend that position vigorously, without contradiction. So, for example, if we say we stand for Ubuntu, equality and fairness as espoused in the AU Charter, and in South Africa's case, the Foreign Policy White Paper and the NDP 2030, that our foreign policy is rooted in Ubuntu, then we must act, consistently in that regard. Now, there are things that the European Union is worried that South Africa is doing that then contradicts some of these positions, and that's why I think they are putting this pressure. However, South Africa should not be pressured by anyone, to take a position that suits them.
With that call and the position South Africa has been put in, what does it mean for South Africa, looking at the sort of relation it has with Russia and the influence, how and what is at stake for South Africa should they choose a side, so to speak?
No, they should not choose sides. You see, this is what I'm saying. So, for example, it is a contradiction to say that South Africa is neutral, but then is planning to engage in military drills with Russia, that are deliberately timed by Russia to coincide with its invasion of Ukraine. So that is a contradiction in itself. If South Africa says we are neutral, then it is a contradiction to frown against the Western strategy of regime change, such as they did in Iraq or Libya, and then be silent about Russia's strategy of removing the current government in Kyiv in the case of Ukraine. So these are the contradictions. I think that South Africa's position should maintain neutrality. Of course, I understand that South Africa has, deep relations, political relations and friendship ties with Russia. But it also has realist interest in terms of, making sure that it doesn't offend people like the United States that have heavy investments in the country, and that which can be hurt if South Africa decides to, go the way of solidarity and friendship with Russia as against its realist economic interests. What I'm saying in essence is that South Africa should take a position and follow that position without ambiguity and be consistent in that. Then, of course, it has the agency, and that's what's been recognized by the United States, by Russia, and even China, that this country is an important country, and it has its own character, its own identity in terms of what it wants to do, and it should just stick with doing that.
So the EU Vice President and Foreign Minister, Josep Borrell, as he made this public appeal to his counterpart, Dr. Naledi Pandor, he was basically saying the European Union doesn't ask Africa to choose sides, but just asking all the countries in the world to at least stand on the side of the United Nations Charter, because what is at stake is the survival of multilateralism. What does that now point to when it comes to South Africa and the considerations that need to be made?
Yeah, and that United Nations Charter that the EU Secretary General talks about is consistent with the principles of South Africa's, foreign policy, the peaceful resolution of disputes. It's push for a fairer and more consistent rule-based multilateral system. These are core tenets of South Africa's foreign policy. So if South Africa says, though, South Africa is also a member of the non-aligned movement, so its foreign policy is very independent and non-aligned, and with a decision not to be, embroiled in great power conflicts. So the fact that South Africa, like it did in March of 2022, immediately after the war, a few days after the war, where it condemned Russia and asked for withdrawal of its forces, then a few days later voted, to be neutral or abstain from the voting. That's one of the contradictions that I'm talking about. So when South Africa says this is the policy of the United Nations, is consistent with our policy of non-alignment, we should stick with that non-alignment. It doesn't mean we can't do business with Russia. It doesn't mean we can't do business with the Chinese. It doesn't mean we can't do business with the United States. But we will not take positions or sides that may end up contradicting our principled position of neutrality or non-alignment. And there could be consequences. I'm not so sure what they would be. There could be, there may not be. I also don't think that South Africa should be pressured by fear of these consequences. What needs to happen is for South Africa to be consistent in its position. That's all.
And surely it shouldn't just be South Africa or other African countries who should play a role in seeking peace. It really should be a bigger effort in terms of the world at large, just like the ways that were used in the world to tackle COVID-19.
Absolutely. And South Africa was one of the biggest push behind that multilateral approach to, COVAX. And I think that because South Africa is a leader, is a leader in the continent of Africa, and is a major role player in important world forums like the G20, and always gets invited to even the G7 meetings. South Africa plays a huge role, but like Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor said, South Africa should not be burdened with the responsibility of solving this problem because it is chair of BRICS right now. Of course, it can use that position to work with India and Brazil and China to try and see if there could be some kind of resolution, based on its principle of non-violence, to see whether they can push Russia to consider other non-violent options for resolving it. But it must not be pressured unnecessarily beyond its abilities and its own interests also, to do any of these things. However, I maintain that South Africa must show a character of consistency with its principles, and back its words with action.
Very well. Thank you so much. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Professor Christopher Isike, the Director of the Center for the Studies in the United States at the University of Pretoria. We continue